Greetings, dear viewers, on my channel Freedom and Manipulation. Today we have a special topic. We will tell you about the top 5 countries where mass protests often take place. This is a fascinating and relevant journey through the countries where citizens take to the streets to express their opinions and demands. Let's get started. 5th place, Algeria. Protests in Algeria. The country's path to change. Protests in Algeria are a phenomenon that has gained tremendous momentum in recent years. The country, located in North Africa, has witnessed mass demonstrations of people seeking change and fighting for their rights. The protests in Algeria found their beginning in 2019 and have not stopped since, celebrating solidarity, resistance and hope for a better future. The origins of the protests can be traced back to the people's dissatisfaction with the political system, economic and social problems, as well as corruption and lack of transparency in government. As the protests escalated, people began to demand political and civil liberties, a fairer distribution of wealth, and better living conditions. Protests in Algeria are guided by common goals and ideals, but each participant expresses their demands and concerns according to their location and push factors. Social networks play a major role in the organization of protests, allowing people to share information, coordinate and express their opinions. This phenomenon confirms the power of technology and its role in contemporary protest movements. Algerian state authorities attempted to suppress the protests, but the persistence and courage of the protesters allowed them to overcome many obstacles. The impact of the protests became evident when the country's president, who had held power for 20 years, was forced to step down under pressure from the people. This was an important moment in the history of the protests in Algeria and a confirmation that the real power of the people can change the course of events. During the protests in Algeria, there were clashes with the police and protesters were subjected to violence. However, the general mobilization and support from different sectors of society helped to build unity and support among the protesters. Peaceful actions, strikes and demonstrations continue, calling for further change. The protests in Algeria have a deep historical and political context. It is a country that has gone through a colonial past and a struggle for independence. Today, people are striving to overcome the new challenges Algeria faces and create a more just and prosperous society. The protests in Algeria are an important part of the global movement for freedom and justice. They remind us of the strength of the people and their aspirations for a better future. As protesters continue to voice their opinions and demands, Algeria continues its journey towards change. The future of the country depends on the government's ability to hear and respond to the demands of the people. 4th place, India. Protests in India are active expressions of civil discontent and disagreement with certain political, social or economic conditions. India has a rich history of protests, beginning with the independence movement in the 1920s and 1930s that led to independence from the British Empire in 1947. Since then, there have been various protests in India, including protests against corruption, racial discrimination, social inequalities, and environmental issues. Social protests are an important part of the political and social dynamics of the country. They reflect the grievances and demands of various groups such as peasants, scheduled castes and others. Here are some of the major categories of social protests in India. Peasant protests in India are often related to issues of land reform, low prices of agricultural products and lack of support from the government. Peasants stand up for their rights and demand fair conditions for farming. These protests may include mass marches, strikes, and road blockades. Scheduled caste movements, Dalits, former untouchables, suffer from systematic discrimination and social exclusion. They hold protests to fight for their rights, equality and justice. These protests may include rallies, marches and civil disobedience actions. Other social protests. Protests related to various social issues such as women's rights, workers' rights, student protests and others also take place in India. These protests reflect social discontent and desire for change. They may be against wrong policies, corruption or violation of human rights. Social protests in India have a long history and have a significant impact on the political situation in India. They often lead to changes in laws and policies, as well as increased awareness of social issues. Third place. United States. Protests in the United States of America are one of the most relevant and significant topics of our time. These large-scale manifestations of social activism shake the country and attract the attention of the world community. The causes of protests in the United States are diverse and historically conditioned. Protests are driven by economic inequality and government policies that strike vulnerable segments of society. Lack of social justice and drastic income disparities cause a huge number of citizens to become discontent, leading to taking to the streets. Political tensions and disagreements between parties and state institutions also contribute to the emergence and development of protest movements. Social media communication and access to information allow large segments of the population to mobilize and express themselves, which creates an atmosphere of instability and unpredictability in society. Protests in the United States are a way for the most active citizens to express their protest and draw the attention of society and authorities to important problems that require immediate solutions. As a result of these actions, there is a gradual change in public consciousness and political sphere. However, at the same time, conflicts and clashes during protests can lead to violence and destruction, which reduces the effectiveness of the message communicated and creates additional problems for the authorities. Protests in the U.S. have become an important factor in the political life of the country, and until they cease, the need for sustainable and comprehensive reforms will be planted in the public discourse. Only through dialogue and acceptance of citizens' concerns can we find ways to overcome social and political inequalities, strive for justice, and create better living conditions for every American. Second place. France. Protests in France began in November 2018 when the government announced an increase in fuel taxes. This displeased many citizens who felt that they were already paying too much in taxes. The protests started in small towns and villages, but soon spread across the country. At the beginning of the protests, participants took to the streets to express their discontent with the increase in fuel taxes. They blocked roads, stopped transportation, and posted pictures of their protests on social media. Over time, however, the protests became increasingly violent. In December 2018, protesters began setting cars on fire, smashing store windows, and clashing with police. The French government was forced to take measures to quell the protests, including the use of tear gas and rubber. The protests continued for several months, and the French government was forced to cancel an increase in fuel taxes. However, protesters continue to take to the streets to express their discontent over other issues such as high housing prices and low wages. In March 2019, protests in France became less violent, but they continued. Participants took to the streets to express their dissatisfaction with the government and demand change, holding rallies, marches, and strikes to draw attention to their issues. Currently, protests in France continue, but they have become less violent. The French government continues to work on solving the problems that caused the protests and hopes that the situation will improve soon. First place. Russia. Appeals to President Putin, on their knees, have become a common form of protest in Russia. People record video messages in which they express their discontent and ask for help. What is this phenomenon? A kneeling protest is a form of protest in which people record video messages to the Russian president while kneeling. This form of protest became popular in Russia in 2018 when a lot of people across the country started recording kneeling appeals. Why do people use this form of protest? People use this form of protest to draw attention to their problems and demands. They believe that a kneeling appeal is more emotional and effective than a regular protest. What problems and demands are expressed in these appeals? By protesting on their knees, people express their dissatisfaction with various problems such as economic hardship, social injustice, and political issues. They also ask for the president's help in solving their problems and demand changes in government policies. How does society react to this form of protest? The public's reaction to this form of protest is varied. Some people support the protesters and their demands, while others criticize their methods and consider them disrespectful. Some people believe that protesting on their knees is an effective way to draw attention to problems, while others believe that it is an ineffective and disrespectful way of expressing their opinions. How do the authorities react to this form of protest? The authorities ignore the protests, deny the problems.